or you can hold your questions to the end of the program. All right, why don't you take it away, Paul?
All right, thank you, Jennifer, and thank you all for joining us this beautiful Sunday afternoon as we are wrapping up our Female Justice series for this year. The talk is about Lois Pantages and her trial for murder. In 1929, she was part of a very powerful family, and as you can imagine, that's going to have a very big effect on the situation that we're talking about today. We're going to start by looking at the background of the family a little bit and her background before going into what happened with this particular incident. So I'm going to wait a moment here to see if my slides advance. There we go. Beautiful. So Lois Mendenhall was from Oakland, and she was born there in the mid-1880s. She was a musical prodigy, a violinist, and became known from a young age for her abilities with that instrument. And on the bottom left here is a short article from the first part of the 1900s, probably about 1902, where it's talking about her having finished high school at Oakland High, and she is going to go to Europe for 3 years to prepare for the concert stage. So obviously she was prepped for a professional career. She did not wind up going to Europe, but she did perform quite a bit in her local area and then a little bit beyond that. On the right is just an early example of when she was performing even in 7th grade at class functions. By 1903-04, you can see her with her incredible mane of hair here on the left and her violin. She was touring, and mostly in the northwestern part of the United States, so California, Seattle, Portland, Oregon, those kinds of places. She was part of a Philharmonic Ladies Quartet of Chicago. And so the assumption that I have and others would have is that she probably was on the circuit, and that's where she met theater impresario Alexander Pantages. Pantages was a native of Greece. His early years are a little bit of a mystery. Somehow he wound up in the Yukon at the end of the 19th century, where there was a big gold rush, Alaska and the adjoining part of Canada. And he met a woman named Klondike Kate Rockwell, who was a well-known performer in vaudeville, and she set him up to open his first theater. And then when he announced he was going to marry young Lois Mendenhall, Kate Rockwell showed up in Seattle, where he had been operating this early theaters, and sued basically for breach of promise, because she said they were essentially living together and he had promised her marriage and all that. So here's Lois trying to start out her married life with this very controversial situation. Eventually, Kate Rockwell kind of vanished, didn't pursue a court case. There may have been a settlement. Who knows what happened with that. But in any case, Lois wound up marrying Alex Pantages in 1905, and it was in Seattle. On the bottom right here is the marriage license for that. Now, Pantages built his theater empire in a very rapid scope of time in really the first part of the 20th century, first couple of decades, many places throughout the Western United States, even into parts of Western Canada. And he even named a theater after his new wife, the Lois, in Seattle. And the couple very quickly had 3 children. They married in 1905. At the bottom here's a 1910 census showing there are 2 sons and a daughter. I don't know why Carmen was given the gender of son and male on the census, but 2 sons and a daughter. And she was really settling in as a housewife, but she still had her musical interest, obviously, and occasionally she would still perform for functions, clubs, and that sort of thing. In 1910, a very interesting article was published up in Seattle about a mansion that Pantages built for his wife. Actually, the way it was talked about was he gave her $100,000 of credit, and you can imagine what $100,000 would have been in 1910 in our money. And she built this Tudor-style house, still there, in a very nice area of Seattle. And this article went to some great lengths to talk about how love and daring, not just stone, built this new house and all of that. So it's definitely being portrayed as sort of a storybook romance for her, and maybe for him, as they were making their lives in Seattle. As I said, she occasionally performed over the years, sometimes coming down to California. So Mount Diablo near the Bay Area, she performed at a function there. The Ebell Club was a big organization of women in Los Angeles. This is in 1919, about the time that the Pantages are moving down here. I like how they described her performance as almost Slavonic temperamentalism. There's a nice multi-syllable word for you. What struck me about this article at the bottom is it says a party of 6 Japanese were guests of the club, 2 of whom spoke briefly and giving a message from the Orient. So keep that in mind as we talk about what happened to her in 1929. What is interesting, and it's not entirely clear why this is, but she was a business partner of her husband. Now, whether that was sort of a name only or whether she really had involvement in the operations of the Pantages Empire isn't entirely clear. But on the top right, for example, they filed incorporation for a Pantages theater company for Tacoma. Wherever Pantages built theaters, they would often start a company in that particular location. You've got state, incorporation you have to do for these individual locations. So it could be Oregon, Washington, parts of Canada, California, what have you. There was a Pantages Huntington Oil Company, which would be Huntington Beach area. And on the bottom left here, it shows that Lois is a incorporator with that. But whether, again, they were sort of sharing their stock together, it was really Alexander's operation, is not necessarily known. It even extended some of the real estate they had. They had buildings in which these theaters were located, and they would sell bonds to finance construction of these. So one on the left is in Portland, the other on the right is here in Los Angeles. And you can see in these descriptions here, owned by Pantages and his wife, as part of their growing empire. In fact, on the one on the right, you can get a really good idea of where they were operating. On the right column here, it says there were theaters in 36 cities. So Los Angeles, San Francisco, Tacoma, Spokane, and then they had expanded into the West, Midwest by that time, Chicago, Cleveland, Minneapolis, and then several cities in Canada from Vancouver all the way over to Toronto. So definitely in a rapidly expanding Pantages empire that she is part of one way or another. The family did move to Los Angeles by 1920. They are captured here in the census, living in an exclusive neighborhood on the west side of Los Angeles. My west side, that's actually more towards mid-city area. All right. Her public presence is not super pronounced during much of the 1920s. Raising the children, perhaps. Maybe some of that is that she's got more of a silent partner aspect or not as publicly involved in the business activities. And so most of what you find in the newspapers about her is as her role with the Pantages Theater Corporation. On the right here, it does say she was a chief stockholder, but then again, it was just basically her and her husband and maybe 1 or 2 other people. But in this article, she is giving her power of attorney to her husband, which leads me to think that maybe it was really him who was running things for the most part. But there were other articles. You can see one in the middle here from Fresno, where they're dealing with building a theater property and then leasing the theater part of the building to the Pantages Corporation, and then being sued up in Edmonton, Oregon, here on the left, because Edmonton, Canada, because of issues with their lease. Alex Pantages was no stranger to controversy. It was a cutthroat business he was in. And so he was as aggressive as he needed to be, apparently, to make sure his empire was growing in competition with other big theater owners throughout the United States. Everything changes dramatically on June 16th, 1929. Lois Pantages is driving her Stutz, which is a very large luxury vehicle, down Sunset Boulevard in East Hollywood, Chi-Town, a little bit east of the 101. She and her husband at that time are living on Vermont Avenue, kind of the end of Los Feliz. And she is apparently driving quite erratically. And she, to some accounts, had actually veered into the opposite lanes of Sunset and then ran into a very small sedan driven by a man named Juro Rokumoto, otherwise known as Joe. He, his wife, their kids, another woman and her 2 children are piled into this relatively little car, and Lois Pantages runs into them. There had been witnesses who had not only been at that scene, but a couple who had actually encountered Mrs. Pantages at locations south and west of that, where they said she had been driving erratically, that she had actually skimmed another car. One gentleman followed her as she continued up to head to Los Feliz from where she had been, visiting a friend, evidently, and accordingly, probably drinking as well. And so there were enough witnesses coming forward at the beginning that it was pretty telling about the situation. So she was originally arrested for being intoxicated and then causing this crash that injured 7 people in the other car. This is a press photo we have in our collection of the Rokumoto vehicle, and you can see it is very severely damaged. It's even sad to see a little doll here on the lower left, and so you can see just how significant this whole situation was. And she had a much bigger car. I have not seen a photo of it to see what kind of damage there was. The paper suggested there was some pretty significant front end damage, but nothing like this. And I'm actually going to skip that because that got left in an earlier slide there, our earlier presentation. So Juro Rokumoto was taken to the hospital. He had a number of injuries, and there was pelvis, femur. There were suggestions that he had a concussion, and he died in surgery shortly after the accident happened. And when they did the coroner's inquest, which is what you do when you have this kind of situation, there's actually a hearing and witnesses and a jury and that sort of thing. They found that in the middle here, it says the jury found that his death was due directly to shock following his injuries. Contributing were tubercular abscesses in his system as well. So I want you to keep that in mind as we go further into the trial and all of that. So then the question is, what does the district attorney's office going to do? Buron Fitz was the county district attorney. He met with some of his deputies, and they decided that they were going to take this to the grand jury based on the coroner's inquest. Now, the coroner's jury did not make any recommendations. They just indicated what had happened, but Fitz and his advisors, or his assistants, then decided that they really should take it to the grand jury. The one thing the coroner's jury did say was that Mrs. Pantages has been driving recklessly, but they didn't go to the lengths of trying to link the death directly to that incident. But that was something the district attorney certainly had the power to do and did do.
Hey, Paul, we had a quick question. Can I throw that in? So we had a question about the age difference between Lois and her husband. Were they about the same age? Was there a big difference in age between them?
Yeah, there was a difference, and we can always go back. That's the great thing about PowerPoint here. So if we look at 1920, 15 years. He was 46 and she was 31. Now, sometimes those don't tell the truth all the time. So let's go back to 1910, 13 years. So there you go. So yeah, between 13 and 15 years difference. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Sure, of course. So when they got married, she was 19, 20 years old. Yeah. All right. So what they did initially was filed a second-degree murder charge. So what you're talking about is just obviously degrees of culpability, whether or not there was an intent. So first-degree murder is you have an intent to commit murder. Second degree would be considered obviously lesser in terms of motive and intent and that sort of thing. Now, Lois was injured and was in the hospital. There is some question about whether she stayed in the hospital longer than she needed to because she had a long series of incidents during this whole period of time where her health was talked about a lot and she was hovering on the verge of life and death. That may all have been true, but it would not be surprising if that was concocted for the purposes of trying to help her out as she's facing these very serious charges. But Buron Fitz definitely told the grand jury that he is convinced, as it says on the right, that the facts justify a second-degree murder prosecution. I should mention that the other members of the Rokumoto family had a series of injuries. The children, for example, were in the back, so they had lacerations. They were sent home pretty quickly. Mrs. Rokumoto had a little more serious injuries, stayed in the hospital for a little while longer, but she and her friend and her friend's children, they all recovered fairly quickly. But then things start to happen. And this is going to be the case also for her husband. And I'll talk about that briefly too. But right away, someone was arrested, William McGee, called Patty for whatever reasons, who was accused of attempting to bribe witnesses. In particular, he went to a Los Angeles Police Department detective, William Dutton. And as you see here in the bottom left, McGee said, hey, if you fix things up all right by not showing up to testify at trial, Dutton had been there on the scene, called, not the scene, but had been called in to investigate the accident and had some interesting things to say about intoxication, because he showed up pretty quickly after the accident and said he could smell liquor on her breath, whiskey, apparently. And so McGee said, hey, if you don't show up, someone will take care of you. And so Dutton then, of course, immediately made that information available to the authorities. McGee wound up being convicted of the charges. It turned out later that he was a brother-in-law of a political boss in San Francisco, former county sheriff up there. He'd also been convicted of accepting a bribe when he was living in Napa County about 15 years earlier, when he was a police officer. So very interesting situation here with that. And this is not limited to bribery. There will be other issues that came up during the course of the trial. So the question is, did the Pantageses go to extraordinary lengths to try to influence the outcome of the trial? That would hardly be a surprise to a lot of us who may know something about what was going on in those days. There is a preliminary hearing that's held before a municipal court judge where evidence is laid out, and then that judge will determine whether or not there is enough to send the case on to the Superior Court. And so that's what wound up happening. There were delays as Mrs. Pantages and her attorneys asked for more time before they answered charges, because she was still in the hospital, still recovering from her injuries, that sort of thing. So delaying winds up being a tactic, if you will, or at least a big part of what goes on during the course of this set of proceedings. And finally, she is going to be held for trial. And as they're getting ready for the trial, we have another incident comes up here on the left. Harry Letterbrink was one of the witnesses on scene. And so he wound up telling the authorities that he had been threatened. So what had happened was there was a deputy district attorney who contacted him and said, okay, we're getting ready to go to trial. Will you be ready to appear on behalf of the state? And as it says here at the bottom of the left article, I will unless something happens. I've been threatened in this case already. So things are starting to get very interesting here. I'll stop here and mention that Mrs. Pantages' husband, Alex, not long after she got in her accident and started getting into her legal trouble, was arrested himself on a charge of attempted sexual assault of a young dancer named Lois Pringle from Orange County. The assault purportedly happened in his palatial theater in downtown Los Angeles. And so Alex Pantages is going to be subject to criminal proceedings right behind his wife. And in his case, which we talked about here as part of the Female Justice series previously, it too involved purported threats against witnesses and other shenanigans. So there is definitely a parallel going on here between what happens with Lois and what happens with Alex Pantages. And here is a little bit about the situation with him. He's going to assert that he was framed and all of that, whole bunch of drama there. I'll give you a little more indication of what happened with that incident if you didn't know anything about it already as we proceed through the course of this presentation. The trial is held in September 1929. This is a press photo from our collection of the very wan-looking Mrs. Pantages seated primly on a chair. Incidentally, all of this markup around her head was done by one of the press companies and newspapers to try to get a better focus on the head and shoulder part of it. But I kind of like the effect there. It surrounds her with a sort of messy environment, because she is definitely, of course, in a great degree of difficulty at this time. And from the get-go, there were issues with this situation with the trial. The first thing, of course, is jury selection. And you're going to have people called in, venire, they call it, where they bring in a bunch of people to be considered for the jury. And there are delays and lots of questions. The article on the right even suggests that she took an active part, because during the proceedings of selecting the jury, she was seen to be whispering to her attorneys quite a bit as part of who to challenge. And if you know anything about jury selection, attorneys have a certain amount of times that they can basically just have somebody removed from consideration. They don't have to say why. Doesn't have to be any indication at all. They can just say number 16 is excused or number 21 is excused, whatever it is. But very interesting, again, that this is something that she's allegedly very involved in. If you look on the one on the right here, there was some interesting discussion here about the fact that Mrs. Pantages was suffering from a nervous condition at the time of the accident, that she was not drunk, she was just merely nervous, that there was no malice. And of course, malice is something that has to be proved when you're convicting for somebody for a second-degree murder charge, for example. There was also suggestion that Rokumoto himself was negligent in causing the fatal crash because some witnesses were uncertain whether he was making a turn onto Sunset as opposed to being on that street when she veered into the other side of the road and ran into him. Part of the problem with witness testimony is you can get 100 people at one location when one event happens, and you're going to get variation. Witness testimony is notoriously inaccurate in many cases. And so they're trying to make use of that. The other is that he just died not because of the injuries of the crash, but because of the operation which followed, which I'll talk a little bit more later as we get into the trial. So again, the defense is laying out its arguments to justify why she is not guilty of the crime for which she is being charged. She does, not surprisingly, have some pretty high-powered attorneys. W.I. Gilbert was her main defense counsel. He had been defense counsel for Amy Semple McPherson, the very prominent evangelist of the Foursquare Gospel Church, Angelus Temple, when she had vanished in 1926 and then suddenly appeared out of northern Mexico claiming she'd been kidnapped, and there were charges being pursued on her for basically, false statements about what happened to her. And they brought in an attorney from New York, Max Stoyer, to help out too. So again, the Pantages have the money, they can bring in high-powered people. And that's something that the state, the prosecution, of course, is going to have to contend with in a very serious way. They wound up eventually selecting the 12 members of the jury, 7 men, 5 women. It was not that much before this, not that many years prior, where juries were still men. Women did not sit on them. So it's not new by this time, but it's certainly something that was fairly recent. And so this is a photo from one of the LA newspapers showing the jury members and alternates as well. You look at the right, and this is one of those things where when you see articles about this incident, almost all of them are going to make reference to the ethnicity of the victim. And they just, I guess, took it for granted that you would just say he was Japanese. Why that mattered is another question. He was a person who happened to be killed or died as a result of a crash. They didn't say, a wealthy Anglo woman, Lois Pantages. It was always, Japanese man, or in this case, Jap. And so it's interesting just to ponder that whole situation. The other thing is you get lots of discussion about Mrs. Pantages, her demeanor, her dress, that sort of thing. Now, of course, Rokumoto was deceased, so you wouldn't, have him being around to be talked about, but there's definitely very little that is mentioned about him or his family, other than that he was a Japanese gardener who had been killed in this crash. As they go through the early stages of the trial, on the right, for example, is where the judge and jury go look at the vehicle, which I presume had been impounded and stored as evidence for the case. And so they go out and take a look at it. Important facts were brought to light during the early stages. And a lot of this had to do with what happened to Rokumoto and the exact cause of death. So if you see on the left here, the subhead is case weakened. In other words, the idea is that there were some questions about whether the cause of death really was that he had a pelvis fracture, that he had dislocated his left hip, or that had happened to him, a blood clot in the brain, the shock. There were also questions about the anesthetic. And in fact, when the defense attorneys questioned some of the doctors who were involved in this, or doctors who would know about this, it's kind of both things, it said some admitted that the anesthetic which was given the injured man might have caused his death. And so the discussion was that under law, any person's death has to be shown to be caused by a direct result of an assault or whatever it is that took place in the event that is being tried. The law also says that death must come within 1 year and 1 day before a murder charge can be proven. Well, that wasn't an issue because it happened very quickly afterwards. But the idea that the case was weakened, according to the press in here, is telling. Now, as I go through the trial and there's more testimony and all of that, a couple of things start to come up. One is the defense and their ability to try to poke holes in witness testimony and who said what, much less the question of the nature of death and the cause of death. So there's a lot of that too. Again, like I said before, witness testimony can be really tricky anyway. And so for defense attorneys, it's fairly easy to try to pick holes in that, especially when you're dealing with a situation where you've got to have a verdict that is going to be fitting the crime. And I should mention too that juries are going to be given options. So it isn't just that it could be second-degree murder, they'll be given other potential rulings to make, for example, manslaughter, which is a lesser charge. But you have more public stuff coming in too to this. So for example, there was a gentleman named Fighting Bob Schuler, who was a very well-known evangelist here in Los Angeles. He had a radio show. He was a bit of a competitor, for example, of Amy Semple McPherson. Schuler loved to intervene in all kinds of things, whether it was corruption in the city of Los Angeles, of which there was no shortage, or the foibles and the failings of the rich and powerful, which again, oftentimes would invite scrutiny. But Schuler had a habit of being very sensationalist, going directly on the radio, talking in very certain terms of what he believed was happening, and that can get him into trouble. He did it with Amy Semple McPherson. He did it with C.C. Julian, a prominent oil promoter who was up for charges during this time for fraud, and other individuals. And so Schuler and another pastor, a guy named Brigleb, were actually subpoenaed by the judge hearing this case. The judge's name was Carlos Hardy. And so Hardy brought these guys in to testify about why they were going out and saying that the jury was a hung jury. In other words, that they weren't going to be able to make a decision. And so again, in terms of what the defense could be thinking about this is that if there's a conviction, they may have a basis for appeal because there's prejudice that could come from the public, for example, or from a person like Schuler on the radio broadcasting his opinions during the course of the trial. Now, usually, defense attorneys do not have their clients testify in a trial. And the reason for that, generally speaking, is that you want the prosecution to prove their case. The burden is on the prosecution. But for Alex Pantages and for his wife, they both wound up taking the stand. Their daughter did as well in this case. On the left here is Carmen Pantages, youngest of the three children. Her fiance, John Considine. Anybody who remembers the show My Three Sons, their son was an actor on that show, which is a little bit tidbit for you of TV history. But in any case, Mrs. Pantages is going to show up and testify in her defense. And of course, she is going to be very emotional about it. She was tearful. Her health was weak. She claimed that she was not drinking. She said that she was doing all she can to try to control her car. The obvious stuff that you would expect in these kinds of cases, but very dramatically portrayed in some of the newspapers. I should mention that in the press, there were a variety of types of papers, the LA Times, the Los Angeles Express. On the right here is the Los Angeles Record, which was more sensational. They would do the dramatic pictures and the stark headlines and that sort of thing. And so that's what you see here on the bottom right. But she is there and she is testifying in her defense. The defense continues to state their objections to a lot of the way that the prosecution is carrying things out. The prosecution, in turn, brings in state doctors to try to buttress their arguments. The trial goes on for about 2 weeks. Interestingly, here on the right, you can see some of the questions and answers that were presented to Mrs. Pantages by Max Stoyer, her defense attorney. And he asked her, "Did you take a drink of intoxicating liquor?" She says, "I did not." She had been at a home further west of where the accident happened. He asked her where he went to, and did she stop at this intersection and what have you. And here on the right, when he says to her, "No, after you turned on Sunset from Western Avenue, What did you do? She said, there was a car in front and other cars turned into Sunset. She said, I tried as hard as possible to get into the middle of the road. Halfway, a car on my right tooted its horn. I pulled over to the left and was at the intersection when the Ford car started to turn left. And then when he asked, tell you when you know the crash, he said, all I know is we came together. I tried to pull the wheel of my car. I tried oh so hard. When the car turned left in front of me, I tried so hard to get by. So that was her explanation of what happened. As I said earlier, one of the main points of the defense argument was that the death of Rokumoto was not the accident itself, it was the treatment that had taken place. So the anesthesia was highlighted, as I said before, and so that's what they were trying to claim. In fact, it's very clearly said here on this article at the top that Juro Rokumoto came to his death as a result of an anesthetic. The automobile accident had nothing to do with the death. Another thing that happened was perjury charges were brought against some of the defense witnesses, 2 of them. And so it just added another layer of controversy onto this. And the judges, the attorneys were battling back and forth about the nature of all of this. And so it got very interesting to see these tangential aspects, if you want to call it that, of other parts of the trial as we went through. And in the closing arguments, the defense tried to turn on the doctor who had treated a guy named Donald Cass. The defense attorney Stoyer even brought a femur bone and a pelvic bone before the jury to say, this is not what caused his death. It wasn't the injuries causing the crash. And what he even says is the state seems to think that Mrs. Pantages' crime lies in the fact that she's the wife of a man of means. So they're kind of playing the class card here, that she's a wealthy person, so of course they're going to go after her. They seem to think that she's been hiring experts to perjure themselves. Well, there were 2 witnesses who were facing perjury charges, much less Patty McGee and his trial for bribery. No one is more guilty of deception than Dr. Cass, is what the defense is trying to say. On the other hand, as the state made its final argument, James P. Costello, the deputy district attorney, was telling the jury, we charge her with an offense of second-degree murder was proper. And he said that, I feel sorry for Mrs. Pantages as her attorneys do, but can we allow our sympathy to run away with discretion? He says she was so drunk that she did not know what she was doing. And as a result, she ran her car into that Ford, injured several persons, and one of them, Rokumoto, ultimately died. At one point, Costello even made reference to the fact that she has high-powered, expensive lawyers. Don't be fooled by the ability for them to hire these prominent people to defend them. The case is relatively simple in his mind. She was drunk, she was driving recklessly, and she led to the death of an innocent person. However, jury deliberations became a problem. They asked several times for more of the testimony to be brought back to them that had been presented during trial so they could go through it again. And so Schumer may not have been that far off the mark in terms of the hung jury part of it, because it took a while for them. And there was even this report in the newspaper that jury near fistfight on the Pantages verdict, because there was a lot of debate in the jury room as they were deliberating about what was going to happen. Again, it's a question of, did she commit second-degree murder as opposed to something like manslaughter? So when they did the balloting, there was a lot of variation there about how to make a determination of what to do with this. And you can see on the right here, Pantages deadlock, meaning the jury was still trying to figure out what they were going to do. Very difficult decision for that group of 12 people to make. What wound up happening after about 2 weeks is that Lois Pantages was found guilty of manslaughter. She collapsed in the court. There was very dramatic reporting about how members of the jury were crying, that the men couldn't look at her, that the women had tears coming down their faces. So it very clearly was an emotional scene in the courtroom. And on the left here shows one of her sons carrying or helping to escort Mrs. Pantages out of the courtroom as she turns away. Actually, I think both of her sons are there. And while she was convicted, she was released on bail pending sentencing. Now, sentencing was supposed to happen by state law within several days of a conviction. But that did not happen for almost 2 months. And we'll get into a little bit of why that was. You may notice on the headline here on the right, and again, the way they refer to Rokumoto is of the time, racialist, if not racist. Retrial will be sought to save Japs killer from 1 to 10 years in jail. There was quite a bit of discretion in terms of the length of sentence. And so it's not uncommon for a sentence to be like that, 1 to 10 years for a serious felony. Interesting little article that came out in, I believe, the Los Angeles Express during this time. Wealthiest woman, also unhappiest. The woman who once had everything that money could buy was the most unhappy woman in Los Angeles today. Obviously highly debatable. There may have been a lot of women who were not very happy at that point, but she was in a state of collapse and under care of physicians at her palatial home in North Vermont Avenue. Again, there was talk about how she was floating between life and death as a result of all these things going on. What her attorneys were going to try to get the judge to agree to was probation for this conviction based on her health and other issues. So it was talked about here, and there's little things like her silk hosiery will be replaced by cotton stockings if she winds up going to jail. She had beauty, wealth, friends, and a social position, but her beauty has been faded by the ordeal of the trial and the breaking down of her health. There's no column, of course, about the widow of Mr. Rokumoto or his kids. It's all about Mrs. Pantages, who was once very beautiful, a gifted musician, et cetera, et cetera. She did appear for a sentencing hearing, and it got put off several times, partly because of her health, but also because what Judge Hardy decided to do was to appoint 3 other judges to hear her plea and to determine whether or not the probation request should be granted. And so this is a little bit unusual, but there had been reports by her doctor that she had had several heart attacks in the preceding weeks and months, aggravated by a nervous breakdown. So again, whether this is something that they're propagating so that they can get more sympathy for her and avoid having her sent to prison is another question. Meanwhile, on the right, before and after of Reverend Schuler and Reverend Gustav Brigleb, the 2 gentlemen who had been proclaiming publicly about the hung jury, on the top, they were waiting for the decision of Judge Hardy about what was going to happen to them. On the bottom, they were smiling. They were found guilty of contempt, but the fine was something like $75 for Schuler and $25 for Brigleb, who insisted he was going to fight that to the Supreme Court of California, but they got off pretty lightly for what they had been propagating in the media, evidently. Strange little things too. Sister Amy Semple McPherson, was reported to have met with Lois Pantages after the conviction, and that made the news because there was some question, I guess, about why that was something that she should be doing. I'm not sure what really that matters, but it's just interesting to see these 2 prominent women having met with each other, given that they had both had the same attorney at some point, but also just maybe sharing their travails in the face of media scrutiny and that sort of thing. At one point, the judge announced that her sentencing would be put off indefinitely. They weren't just waiting for those 3 judges or waiting for her to get better. There was also a probation department report that they were hoping to have sooner. There was a delay there, so that took some time, obviously. And so what happened finally in early November, this is quite a long time after her conviction, is that she was given probation for 10 years. And the headline here or the caption of the photo on the bottom right, women freed on good conduct for 10 years. And her nurse and a doctor cover her up during the sentencing hearing as that is happening. Not only was she given probation for 10 years, but there was a settlement. She paid out $78,500 to Mrs. Rokumoto and her family. This is the only time I saw anything mentioned about the family during this whole thing. And you can see Mrs. Rokumoto here on the left with her attorney, William Bonelli, who was a former city council president who had just run for mayor of Los Angeles and did not win. This is not the Bonelli from Bonelli Park up in San Dimas. That was a county supervisor later on. Bonelli here with Mrs. Rokumoto and her 4 children. But you can see the headline is not about her. It's about Bonelli using his fee. He got $19,000 out of the $78,500 so that he could pay off $12,000 in campaign debts. That was the focus of the article, not about the pain and suffering of the family, but about Bonelli and his political situation. So there was the probation and the payout. That was basically the settlement here. I'll also mention here on the bottom right of the left article, there is a reference to the fact that Alexander Pantages had just been convicted of sexual assault of Eunice Pringle. So you have both husband and wife dealing with their sentencing issues at that time. Alex Pantages wound up getting a sentence. I think it was along the lines of the 1 to 10 years at San Quentin. He wound up appealing, and his defense attorney was able to convince the Supreme Court of California, which was not allowable before, but it was starting with this case of Alexander Pantages, that a defense attorney could examine the character of the victim. And so what he did is he went after young Eunice Pringle and accused her of being open and a party girl and that sort of thing. And that appeared to have worked, because in 1931, Alex Pantages was acquitted on a second trial of that sexual assault. So wife gets 10 years probation, husband eventually is acquitted in his case. But it gets even worse. A year later, Judge Hardy, who was stepping down as a judge, so it's kind of a last minute thing. We all know about clemency by governors and pardons by presidents. Well, judges would do this kind of thing too. He freed 150 people at the last minute who had been convicted of felonies right before Christmas. This is in 1930. And among those who were freed was Mrs. Pantages. She had applied for pardon, as I mentioned. He had given her the probationary period of 10 years, and then he just wiped the slate clean. Not only was the probation revoked, but her record was cleared out. There would be no record that she had been ever convicted of a felony. A pretty dramatic situation. And there was discussion about the fact that she had claimed poor health. There was discussion about the fact that she had paid out the $78,500 to the family. Hardy himself did not say why he revoked her probation, but these were things that were talked about in the press as to why that would happen. Now, Buron Fitz, the DA, was obviously very unhappy. He was quoted as shouting when he heard about this. It's an outrage, a disgusting travesty on justice. He said there could be no legitimate excuse for the final release of all of these felons, who were, after all, convicted by juries after proper trials. But worse, he says, is that people should be released of every last restraint when the city is desperately fighting a criminal orgy, which is probably more acute than ever before. Fitz went on to say, as to the restoration of Mrs. Pantages to complete liberty, it seems to me that Judge Hardy acted on one of the most flimsiest excuses I've ever heard, that her son wished to be married. It was, in fact, one of the pleas made by her defense attorneys that she had 3 children and that they were going to be going into social life. Again, this is the bubble that the wealthy people live in. I mean, how can they go into the social world if it's known that their mother was a convicted felon? And so that's how the argument was being made. And that's why Fitz reacted the way he did. He said, moreover, that they spent 5 weeks work on this case. Now, today it would be 5 months or 5 years, given how long it takes to get these cases to trial today, and a good amount of people's money. He said she was found guilty by a jury. She got leniency when she was placed on probation. And the other article here on the right, he even says, sometimes I wonder what's the use. It cost the state X amount of money, and now they've been dismissed. It's disgusting and an outrage. So again, she was cleared. This is 1930. Alex Pantages, as I mentioned before, the following year was acquitted. He lived another 4 years, died in 1935. He was forced to sell off a good part of his fortune. The Pantages Theater in Hollywood, which still exists, was just being completed at the time this was all going on. The family sold that, presumably to deal with these legal issues. And Lois herself did not live that much longer. In 1941, she was on her yacht, anchored off Avalon, and she died of a heart attack. She was actually in the water swimming when she had a heart attack and passed away. So lived maybe 10 years after all this. Now, as I said, as we wrap up here, the coverage in the media was 99.99% Lois Pantages, maybe a little less than that, and not much at all about Rokumoto or his family. So I wanted to finish this presentation by talking about them a little bit, because after all, these are human beings whose lives were torn apart by this incident. And the only article, as I said, that I found was not really about them, but about their attorney and how he's going to use the settlement money or his fee from the settlement money to pay off his political debts. There's not a lot you can find about the family. I poked around a little bit. I did find Juro Rokumoto's World War I registration card. This is September 1918. At the time, the family was living in Riverside. He was a janitor at the Tetley Hotel, which was, a fairly prominent hostelry in town. There's now another building located on that site today. The family remained there in Riverside for several years, so was able to find them in the 1920 census. By the mid-20s, the family had moved into Los Angeles and were living out in Boyle Heights. And so in the city directory for 1924, Joseph Rokumoto was a porter, so presumably working in a hotel as he had done in Riverside. The death record shows up very cold and clinical and statistical, showing Juro Rokumoto here, date of death, June 19, 1929. The census that was taken in 1930, shortly afterwards, shows his widow and 3 of their 4 children living in an area heavily populated by Japanese, just a little bit west of downtown Los Angeles, renting a structure out there. But other than that, there wasn't really that much information that I could find about the family. But I wanted at least to get something in the presentation to put a little more humanity into the status of the victims in this particular incident. So hopefully you got a good sense of how this case developed, some of the issues that were at hand, the treatment of a very wealthy white woman, as opposed to what happened to her Japanese victim and his family. And we maybe have seen some changes, maybe we haven't, but in any case, this is an avenue or aspect of female justice that I thought would be interesting to bring forward, because a lot of these cases we've been dealing with, rightly so, have been about how women have been treated by the justice system or by the media as victims or as defendants. And in this case, we're looking at a situation where Mrs. Pantages may very well have benefited from the power and privilege that she possessed. So Jennifer, I'll turn it back over to you and any questions as well. Thank you all.